direct. You also have a message that it's going live?
Yep.
Okay, so up, we go live. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I don't know how many of you are now already on Facebook. Let me have a look. And yeah, brilliant. Gosh, it works really well. Shabbat Shalom. 4 people already and counting. So, yes, please. And see, yes. Okay, Shabbat Shalom and welcome to our Erev Shabbat service, Parashat Chukkat. And tonight we have a special guest, our member, Professor Alissa Goodman, who is a professor. She'll explain a bit more later. I don't want to say something wrong. She's professor at University College London, and she was awarded a CBE in the last Queen's birthday honor list, and she will talk to us later about her work, and also you will have a chance to ask her questions about the work she's doing. And let's start our Shabbat service on page 61, and Natalia will light the candles for us.
Am I muted? No. In the spirit of our ancient tradition, which unites and sanctifies the house of Israel in all lands and ages, we welcome the Sabbath by kindling these lights. Baruch ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedishanu v'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lechadlik ner shel Shabbat.
Amen. Thank you, Natalia. Page 70. לכו נרננה, לכו נרננה, לכו נרננה לאדוני. לכו נרננה, לכו נרננה, לכו נרננה לאדוני. נריה נריה לצור אישנו נקדמה פניו בתודה. נריה נריה לצור אישנו בזמירות נריה לו. לכו נרננה, לכו נרננה, לכו נרננה לאדוני. לכו נרננה, לכו נרננה, לכו נרננה לאדוני. Page 71 for Psalm 96. Sing a new song to the Eternal One. Sing to your Creator, all the earth. Sing to the Eternal One, praise God's name, proclaim God's salvation from day to day. And remember, our sages have put 7 psalms before the Baruch Hu on Erev Shabbat, representing the 7 days of creation. And it's a bit like a journey through the psalms and through the process of creation, and it's mainly spiritual creation, you know, how everything came to life and to be into being, not in a physical way, but in a spiritual way. שירו לאדוני שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני כל הארץ נפלאותיו, כי גדול אדוני ומהולל מאוד. נורא הוא על כל אלוהים, איי איי איי, כי כל אלוהי עמים אלילים, באדוני שמיים עשה, הוד והדר לפניו, עוז ותפארת במקדשו, אבו לאדוני משפחות העמים, אבו לאדוני כבוד ועוז, אבו לאדוני כבוד שמו, השתחוו לאדוני בהדרת קודש, אלי חילו מפניו כל הארץ, אמרו בגויים אדוני מלך, אף תיכון תבל, בעל תימות הדינמים, ידינמים במשרים, ישמחו השמיים ותגל הארץ, ירם הים ומלואו, יעלו שדי וכל אשר בו, אלי אז ירננו כל עצי יער לפני אדוני, קיווה לשפוט הארץ, ישפוט תבל בצדק ועמים באמונתו, ועמים באמונתו, לי לה לי לה לי לה 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 לי, יא לה 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 לי, יא לה 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 לה, יא לה 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 לה. Oh, Dan, Shabbat Shalom. I can see you here on Facebook. I hope your second job wasn't too traumatic. Sometimes it depends which one you have. Sibyl, Shabbat Shalom to you, Sibyl, and Anna as well. Shabbat Shalom to you, Anna. Jill, Norman, and Joyce. It's good to have you, Joyce, and Jill, and Norman. Holly, Shabbat Shalom to you, Holly. And Deborah, Shabbat Shalom to Bradford. And Carol, Shabbat Shalom to Carol. So we have a date for a coffee and maybe a piece of cake next week. Shabbat Shalom to you, Julie and Sarah. Shabbat Shalom, Sarah. I hope Socks is there tonight as well. Jason from Dublin. Shabbat Shalom, Jason. And Sandra Levine. You haven't said Shabbat Shalom, boss. I want this. Please put it there. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom to Celia. Celia, I was supposed to give you a call and then I got very, very busy and I completely forgot. So my public apologies to you, Celia. I will remedy to that next week. So, Shalom Aleichem on page 76. And remember last week, we read a passage from the Talmud, which explains that on Shabbat, we have an additional, according to the tradition, we have guardian angels. We are with us and protect us. And the Jewish tradition tells us that on Shabbat, we have an additional guardian angel, which helps us because on Shabbat, we have a neshama yetera, an additional soul, something more. And remember in Judaism, what's really sacred is not place, not objects. What's sacred in Judaism is time. It's really what's important for us. Shalom Aleichem, Malachi Shalom, Malachi Elyon, Mi Melech, Malachi Amelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem leShalom, Malachi Shalom, Malachi Elyon. Mi melech malachi hamelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Bachuni leShalom malachi HaShalom malachi Elyon. Mi melech malachi hamelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tzedchem leShalom, Malachi HaShalom, Malachi Elyon. Mi melech Malachi HaMelachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Page 91. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. שמור וזכור בדיבור אחד, השמיענו אל המיוחד, אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, לשם ולתפארת ולתהילה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, כי היא מקור הברכה, מראש מקדם נסוכה, סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. התעוררי, התעוררי, כי בעורר קומי יורי, אורי יורי שיר דברי, כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. בואי ושלום עטרת בלה, גם בשמחה ובצהלה, תוך אמונה עם סגולם. בואי חלה, בואי חלה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. Page 91, over to you, Dominique.
We have welcomed the Shabbat with songs and psalms. Let's now move to the core of the service. We are on the bottom of page 92. Baruch hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam Vaed. We praise you, eternal one, our God, sovereign of the universe, whose word brings on the evening, whose wisdom opens heaven's gates, whose understanding changes times and seasons, and whose will sets the stars in their courses in the sky. You make day and night, rolling light away from darkness and darkness from light. You make day pass and bring on the night and separate day from night. You rule the hosts of heaven. Baruch atah Adonai, Hama'arif Aravim. We praise you, O God, whose word makes evening fall. Unending love have you shown your people, the house of Israel. Torah and mitzvot, laws and precepts have you taught us. When we lie down and when we rise up, we will reflect on the meaning of your laws and rejoice in the words of your Torah and your mitzvot forever. On them we will meditate day and night, for they are our lives and the length of our days. May your love never depart from us. Baruch atah Adonai, Ohev Amo Yisrael. We praise you, O God, you love your people Israel. Please stand for the Shema if you want to. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kevod, Malkuto, לעולם ועד. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבבך. ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך. וקשרתם להיות על ידך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We may resume our seat. למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם. All this we hold to be true and sure. You alone, eternal one, are our God, and we are Israel, your people. You have freed us from oppressors and delivered us from tyrants. You led us out of Egypt forever to serve you in freedom. When we witness your power, we praise your name and gave thanks. Willingly we accepted your rule. Then, full of joy, we sang together. Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, nora tehilot oseh aleh, nora tehilot oseh aleh. Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, Adonai yimlok le'olam va'ed, Adonai yimlok le'olam va'ed. And it has been said, the Eternal One has delivered Jacob and redeemed us from the hand of one stronger than ourselves. Baruch atah Adonai Ga'al Israel. We praise your God, Redeemer of Israel. Grant, eternal God, that we may lie down in peace and let us rise up to life renewed. Spread over us the shelter of your peace. Guide us with your wise counsel, and for your name's sake, be our help. Shield us from sickness and war, from famine and distress, and keep us from wrongdoing. Shelter us in the shadow of your wings, for you are our guardian and deliverer, a gracious and merciful God. Guard our going out and our coming in, that now and always we may have life and peace. Baruch atah Adonai, haporei sukat shalom aleinu ve'al kol yoshe tevel. We praise your God. May your sheltering peace descend on us and all who dwell on earth.
Now we move to the Amidah, which Rabbi René is putting on screen. I hope everybody can see it. It's a shortened version of the Amidah, but we'll begin as usual with the prayer that God allows us to find the enthusiasm to open our lips so that our mouth may declare God's praise, which I'm sure is an invitation for you to read along. Please do so if you wish. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, and God of those who came before us, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God of Sarah, God of Rebekah, God of Rachel, and God of Leah. Great, mighty, and revered God, God transcendent, maker of heaven and earth. With a word, you shielded our ancestors. With a phrase, you give all things life. Sacred God, beyond compare, who took joy in providing rest for your people on your holy Shabbat day. We will serve you reverently, acknowledging on each and every day forever just who you are, the one to whom blessing goes, the one to whom thanksgiving is due. Source of peace, who recalls the time of creation by sanctifying Shabbat, blessing the seventh day, and in holiness, granting rest to a people overflowing with joy.
And we take now a few moments for private prayer and meditation. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Ose shalom bimromav, uyase shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Israel, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel. Yahase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Israel. Yahase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Israel. Yahase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Israel. Yahase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol bnei Adam. Shabbat Shalom and Shabbat Shalom to those who have joined us in the course of this service. So tonight we have a very special occasion. We would like to welcome a KLS member, Professor Alissa Goodman, who has received the CBE, so it means Commander of the British Empire. I didn't know that it was still existing, but you are Commander of the British Empire now, for a service to social science in the Queen's Birthday Honors. Alissa is Director of the UCL Center for Longitudinal Studies. All research has focused on inequality and poverty, and the intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage, and recently how these have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So Alissa, without further ado, please, I leave you the floor. So you will have a presentation, and then our members who are on Zoom and those who are on Facebook can ask you questions.
Okay, well, let me see if I can show, whoops, I didn't mean to do this. Hang on, there we go. Can somebody nod if they can see my slides? So thank you very much, Rabbi, and to the congregation for inviting me. It's very new, the news came out last weekend, so my smile muscles are still a little sore from the honor and the happiness and the pride that I felt in being awarded the CBE. And then it's absolutely wonderful to be invited here to talk to you about it. I think if any of you do know me at all, it will have been from my son Adrian attending the Beitenu and not much else. So it is a wonderful opportunity for me to introduce myself to you anyway and to say hello and to be part of this community. So thank you, Rabbi. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit. I wondered whether to give you some sort of potted history of my career or something, but I'm really going to focus on what it is that I do now. And as the Rabbi said, I'm director of something called the Center for Longitudinal Studies, which is part of the UCL Institute of Education. And at the bottom there is my Twitter handle. So if you wanted to follow me on Twitter, please do. So I run the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, and when we all used to work together in person, this is what we looked like. We all now, like many of you, I imagine, work from home, but there I am in the middle with my team and thinking fondly of those happy days, that's Gordon Square, when we could sit together. Looking forward to when we can do it again. So essentially what we do at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies is that we follow people across life. So we run these 4 major national longitudinal studies that have been essentially following large representative groups of people since their birth and periodically across the whole of their lives. And these are called birth cohort studies. And the 4 that we run are a group of people born altogether in 1958. It's the oldest of our studies there at the top. The 1970 British cohort study, a study called Next Steps, who were all born around 1989 and 90. And then the most recent national birth cohort study in the UK of young people born all around the year 2000. That was the last time one of these was launched. Now, the UK is very unique in the world in having such a long-standing tradition of birth cohort studies following people throughout their lives. In another kind of partner centre in UCL, there's the oldest one in the world, which is the 1946 birth cohort study. And it's really only around the millennium when a big crop of them have kind of sprung up worldwide. But we're the only country in the world to have this series of birth cohorts that follow people across life. So just to give you a bit of an idea of what that might mean. So the National Child Development Study, the 1958 study, this is like a sort of timeline of the study. So the year in which it was initiated, the ages at which we followed up the people who are in the study, and the sample sizes, so the number of the original group of babies who were enrolled by their mothers, and how well we've followed them through time. So this was like a census of all babies born. It really was a kind of miracle of social cohesion in the UK, that the sample for the NCDS, all births in a single week across the whole of the UK in March 1958, and an astonishing 98% of all babies born across the UK were enrolled at that time into the study. So this 17,000 babies that we had at the outset was basically all the babies born, and they were enrolled by their midwives. And now 60 plus years later, we still have more than 60% of those that are still alive and haven't emigrated taking part in the study. So it's really an astonishingly precious thing. I have a kitten. Oh, my kitten's come to join in. I'm not sure how well this works on Zoom. We had a little animation for their 60th birthday. Maybe, Craig, could you nod if you can see an animation? Is there something growing on the screen? Brilliant. So we recently celebrated their 60th birthdays with them just a couple of years ago, and it was a sort of tremendously emotional year for us as the sort of leaders of the study, as well as we hope we celebrated and appreciated the study members. In terms of what these studies are used for, so these are some of the sort of scientific and research questions. So Rabbi mentioned that I was awarded for contribution to the social sciences, but they're very much sort of joined up biomedical and social studies. And we work across the sort of population health and social science. But some of the types of questions that these studies allow us to answer are things, really important things, like the long-term effects of early life circumstances. So how circumstances in your childhood then go on to affect and how your outcomes pan out later in life. The intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage. So things like patterns of social mobility in this country, and why does advantage tend to spawn advantage and disadvantage likewise, and how can we break those cycles? It's very good for looking at individual change over time. So how do people's life courses develop and why? And then because we have these several studies all together, we can look at the changing experiences of different cohorts. So what I'm going to do is now just show you a few research results that have been very striking to me across my working career that have come from these studies. I think they illustrate each of these different sort of research purposes that we use them for quite nicely. So this is some work I did several years ago now, which was using sort of piecing together a series of these studies in terms of the cognitive tests that we took of children while they were at school at different ages. So members of the studies would have been taken out of their normal classroom and asked to do cognitive tests that we then were able to score. And you can see here we've got the quintiles of the income distribution, so fifths essentially of the income distribution from richest to poorest, and we can chart the average ranking of the pupils according to where in the income distribution you came. And what this shows, starting from age 3 and then going up throughout childhood, the inequalities in cognitive development start very early in life. So they're very apparent from the age of 3. You can see the poorest children on average being, 30 percentiles of the distribution lower than the richest children, and this sort of gradient across the income distribution. So you can see the inequalities in cognitive tests that start early through childhood and then they widen across childhood. So raising the question, why do rich children outperform poor children in cognitive tests at school? Okay, so then another research example, which is linking these early life circumstances, so inequalities that happen when you're younger, how do they pan out for how things turn out in your life later on? And again, focusing in inequalities in income and thinking now about poverty, we developed for the 1958 cohort a measure of persistent poverty throughout their adult lives. We could also have looked at their income in their childhood, but for this particular project, which was for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we looked at persistent poverty across your adult life and how that would then be impacting at age 55 on certain key aspects of your life that are markers for potential vulnerability in terms of aging, as you might progress beyond your mid-50s. So those who had been persistently poor in terms of low income across their lives were much more likely to have, or much less likely to have certain securities like living with a partner. You can see the red blocks there. You'd be much less likely to have the security of living with a partner at age 55, much more likely to be in rented housing compared to home ownership, more likely to have been not employed, never having paid into a pension scheme, in poor health, and also suffering from poor mental well-being. So the idea that these inequalities that are very persistent are also potentially quite damaging, and important for policy to be addressing that for people all the way across the life course, but it's never too late. And we know that the aging sort of prospects for those who have suffered disadvantage across their lives are going to be vulnerable and need support. So here's another one. This is quite a common, I've only got one more after this one, I think. So here's another one. This is quite a complex one, but the more you look at it, the more it reveals. This wasn't my own research, this was some of my colleagues, but this is about body mass index. So I said our studies are about health as well as about sort of social outcomes. So we have on the bottom axis, we have people's age, and then on the top, we have their body mass index. And we have 3 cohorts here in pink, green, and blue, which are the 1946, 1958, 1970 cohorts. And you can see an upward slope across all of them, which just shows that throughout your adult life, as you get older, on average, typically BMI goes up. So we're getting fatter as we get older. But then you can see the difference between the dotted and the non-dotted, the sort of straight lines, those who were in the highest and lowest social class categories as children. So you can see the dotted lines for each cohort lie above the non-dotted ones, which means that if you came from a poorer background, you're more likely to have a higher body mass index throughout your adult life than if you came from a richer one. And then if you look at the difference in where the pink, green, and blue lines are lying, you can see that there's a successive upward shift across the generations in the body mass index. which shows that successive generations are on average becoming fatter. And there are some differences in the inequalities, so between the rich and poor. So the slight widening there in the blue one is compared to the pink and the green is of interest. But basically, adult BMI, this is for men, but it's a similar picture for women, are on the rise across generations, and there are inequalities which persist. And we've done a similar one, which is really very concerning again on mental health. So we don't have the differences between rich and poor here, but we do have the three cohorts, the 1946, the 1958, and the 1970, and this life cycle pattern in psychological distress. And you can see, especially for the 1946 and 1958 cohorts, that you have this pattern of relatively high levels of distress in adolescence, which then dip towards your people's 30s and then rise up quite sharply during their 40s, sort of peaking with this sort of peak of mental distress around the age of 50 and then declining. So quite an interesting sort of bounce there in patterns of psychological distress. But the really striking thing about this chart is how different the 1970 cohort is at a similar age than the 1958 born and 1946 born cohorts were. So especially, well, both for men and women, in fact, in these charts, much higher levels of psychological distress reported at a given age than for their sort of predecessor cohorts. So some real concerns in terms of social trends in population health. And these are all taken sort of pre-COVID. So we're not looking at sort of generational differences that are caused by current circumstances, but real sort of cohort trends over a long period of time. So I'm going to tell you, I think, maybe three more things, but very briefly. So one, I wanted to tell you about what was probably my most favorite project that I've worked on, certainly in the last 5 years, but maybe altogether. And this was looking at, the title of the project was, Can the language of 11-year-olds predict their future? And there's quite a sort of amazing thing that the 1958 cohort did when the study members were 11 years old. So as well as getting them to fill out those cognitive tests that I told you about that allowed us to kind of rank them by their peers, they also asked all the 11-year-olds up and down the country, this is back in 1969, to write an essay. And this was the essay that this is what the 11-year-olds were asked to write about. Whoops, sorry. It says, imagine you're now 25 years old, which is obviously impossibly old in the mind of a 11-year-old. Write about the life you're leading, your interests, your home life, and your work at the age of 25. So this is just an example of one of the essays that was written. There were about more than 10,000. They were all on microfiche, sort of languishing in the basement of the Institute of Education with no means for sort of analysing them at scale. So anyway, this is an example from one of our study members called Sally. Here she wrote, I am sitting in a ward on night duty. I will soon be a, and she first put staff nurse and then she crossed it out and wrote sister. I enjoy the hospital, although the work is very hard. That's just an example of one. We managed to raise money to have all 10,000 of them transcribed for the first time, so digitized. And we've done an absolutely amazing project using machine learning to extract like the linguistic features of the essays and see which choice of language and words and topics that people raised predict different outcomes in their future. So we also did a lovely thing in the 60th birthday year, which is when we managed to transcribe them. So this is Sally on the left here with her picture of herself at age 11 and now around her 60th birthday, and other of our cohort members who did the same. We had this lovely feature on the BBC One show where they were looking at their essays and talking about how their lives had turned out. So we do sort of qualitative work as well as quantitative, but also some real number crunching around which types of language predict outcomes. And I guess the striking thing is that the things you wrote about and the words that you used at age 11 were highly predictive across a range of different outcomes, including social mobility, your cognitive function, in your 50s, your levels of physical activity and your mental health. So it really was a very special project for lots of reasons. We've been very busy during COVID. Rabbi mentioned that we've been looking at inequalities during the COVID pandemic, and we rushed into the field and have done 3 surveys with study members across 5 national cohorts, R4 and the 1946, and had more than 34,000 people taking part in those over the past year in order to help us understand the economic and social and health impacts of the COVID crisis, the extent to which it's widening or narrowing inequalities, and the lifelong factors which have shaped vulnerability and resilience to its effects. So this chart here is the final sort of chart that I'm going to show you. And it's one of many coming out not just from our studies, but across the social science community, illustrating how the pandemic has been likely to have been widening already pre-existing inequalities quite significantly. So here we have people who reported that prior to the pandemic, they were living comfortably, that's the light blue, doing all right, that's the gray, or struggling before the pandemic. And then the proportion of those in each of those categories and across 4 different cohorts here, the age 50, whether they were age 62, that's our 1958 cohort, or down to age 19, that's our millennium. So what you can see by the sort of upward slope across the 3 bars in each of these cohorts is that those who reported that they were struggling prior to the pandemic were much more likely to say that they had become worse off during the pandemic than those who were doing all right, or those who were living comfortably. And we have lots of different metrics of how they were doing, not just these qualitative assessments, but they all sort of pull in the same direction. And finally, I think the thing that's keeping me most busy at the moment and is really tremendously exciting is that the Economic and Social Research Council, who fund the studies that we run, have recently awarded us a large grant to work through in detail the feasibility of a new birth cohort for the UK. So we're looking to pilot something very much like a new birth cohort study starting in April next year. So some of the babies that are going to be born next year, we hope to be catching up with them and their families and enrolling them into a new study very soon. So thank you very much for listening to me. And like the Rabbi said, I'd be very happy to take any questions if there are any. And thank you.
Thank you, Alissa. It's really, really, really fascinating. So now I understand the term longitudinal, it's length of a life. So it's really interesting. So before I open to the floor, I have 2 questions for you. So the first is about the BMA communities, which were very hit very harshly by COVID. Are they part also of your research? Is it a variable that you take into account? And my second question is about once you've reached conclusions in your studies, because you've raised some very big issues there. So I guess you transfer it to the authority, I mean, to politicians for them to inform their policy making.
Yeah, so thanks for those questions. So we do have ethnicity and BAME in our studies. In the younger studies we're much better equipped to look at that than the older studies, because we're birth cohort studies. One thing that we haven't done with the older ones is to augment them. So when they were children, we did add immigrant children who had arrived in the country and they were in the same birth week. We did add them to the study, but as they've grown to adults, we haven't added adults who have subsequently arrived. So our proportions of ethnic minorities in the older studies are a bit low compared to the true population now. But with the younger ones, we oversampled to begin with on ethnic minority sort of strong areas. And so we have been showing some of the inequalities in BAME outcomes that have been quite prominent in the news, and it is a focus of our study. And yes, we do our very best to do sort of policy relevant briefings, especially when we have big new sort of study sweeps that have just reported. We tend to do briefings, and I think our most sort of prominent ones of those recently have come from the Millennium Cohort Study. So we have a whole suite of government departments who co-fund the Millennium Cohort Study, and we've been doing a lot in recent years highlighting the major problems in terms of adolescent mental health and what an explosion there's been. I could have mentioned, I could talk for another half an hour and tell you a lot more than I did just now. But one of those things is around the kind of huge, unfortunate explosion in adolescent mental health problems. And also really interesting things about risky behaviors in teenage life. Actually, sort of some of the risky behaviors that in my generation, a lot of people indulged in, like sort of drinking, and some drug taking has gone down. But it's sort of shift in the risky behaviors among young people that's of some interest as well. But things like knife carrying of quite major concern. So yeah, real mixture. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we have a question from Lior. Given how early we start separating out depending on people, so Leo, would you mind unmuting yourself and maybe asking the question instead of me reading with my heavy French accent?
I'm not sure my heavy German accent will make that any better, but let's see. No, this was so fascinating, and I'm wondering, given that the differences show up so early, what are ways to do something about that, either in very early age to make sure it doesn't already start splitting out, or what are good kind of ways or points to catch up in quotation marks later? So
I think, some of the people who work in my field coined this phrase, never too early and never too late. So, and I think it really applies to the types of social inequalities that we look at. So we've been working quite closely when we've been developing this new birth cohort study with various third sector organizations that come together under the umbrella of something called the First 1001 Days movement. And they're really focused on kind of policy and practice in the very early years. And what can we do to try and sort of stem this sort of explosion of inequality that happens so very soon. And there's a real tension there between how much of this should be kind of big structural policies like fixing poverty and sorting out housing versus how much should we be doing like early intervention programs with like parents of babies who you can identify early on that are at particular risk. So, very young parents who have been through difficulties in their own lives in terms of mental health or other sort of major problems. And I think, the answer is both. We need some happy mixture of both. I think it's so clear that these inequalities persist despite the fact that we have, a strong, certainly it's at certain times we've had a very strong welfare state. We have an NHS that is far more equalizing than other types of health systems around the world. And still we have a very unequal society. The thing with the 1958 cohort and the sort of evidence that those who had been in persistent poverty across their working lives were at risk. The 1958 cohort, relatively, it's very unequal, but the sort of prospects in terms of their older age are actually quite strong. In some ways, they were part of a golden generation who had access to company pensions that were fairly generous, and a lot of that is being dismantled among the younger sort of generation. So the concern sort of persists all the way through to sort of pensions policy and health policies in older age and employment and so on.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question? Yes, Sandra, please.
Hello. So interesting, Alissa. I have a question about whether, and if so, why, social mobility opportunities have declined, because you have shown this persisting inequalities. But thinking of so many of us in the Jewish community in Britain are the grandchildren of the big wave of immigration from Eastern Europe around the turn of the century, and have come from grandparents who couldn't read and write, or certainly couldn't read and write English, and yet the third generation are all in professional jobs. And that applies to just about everybody in both mine and my husband's family. But why is that not happening anymore? What was different back in, the early part of the 20th century that has changed?
It's a massive question, and I think there's a few different answers to that question, to be honest. I think it's important to look at both what we call absolute and relative mobility. So it's certainly been the case for a long time that each successive generation has expected to do better kind of in absolute terms than their parents did and their parents before them. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still a relative advantage for those who came from better off families than those who came from worse off families, because there was a sort of growth in opportunities at the top, restructure of the occupational structure of the UK, which meant less manual jobs and more highly paid white collar jobs, and a sort of general sort of rising of the boat. So there's certainly it's certainly the case that people who study specifically like the immigrant experience, there's a different kind of pattern like the one that you've described, that often the people who make it to the new country are ones who are especially sort of dynamic and motivated, and who have made it here but have given up a lot in their home country for whatever reasons, to sort of start again at the bottom of the ladder, but then place a very high emphasis on sort of education and studying and bettering yourself, which is then reflected in the experiences of the generations which follow. So it's quite a sort of complex set of things. And then even like in recent years, I do feel, when I look at the various statistics and data that I do, that sort of social policy and education policy that puts a strong emphasis on equalization does work. Like you could see reflected in various statistics from the era when Labour was in power and before austerity, that some of those measures of kind of inequalities, educational inequalities in children, like started to flatten and go down a bit. But I expect they're probably going to really be like exploding again, unfortunately, recently, with what's happened in the pandemic. And there's various sort of indicators that are suggesting that. So it's quite a complex set of things that go on there. But it is a really fascinating sort of topic, and one that our studies has been very, very instrumental in illuminating, because with the 1958 cohort, before that cohort, there was actually no nationally representative data set that could show you how linked childhood circumstances were to adult outcomes. So the first real robust measures of social mobility in various dimensions came from that 1958 cohort, and then the comparisons that have followed from them. And now we have tons of data that comes out of government that gives us so much more. But back in the day, these were really the only studies that could tell you much about it at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think Vince has a question. Yes.
Thank you, Renee. Alissa, hi.
Hello.
First, an anecdote to continue the conversation you had with Sandra, and then a coincidence worth noting. The anecdote first. My great-grandfather, I'm told, was a frequently imprisoned stonemason. My grandfather, his son, was a traveling salesman. My father was a factory floor worker, and I recently retired, well, a few years ago, as a professor of applied econometrics.
Oh, fantastic.
But here's the coincidence. My most recent publication, which is work I've done since retirement with a Korean colleague, uses your 1970 BCS.
Oh, awesome. Good.
And I had absolutely no idea that I should be giving thanks to a fellow member of KLS for that data set.
Oh, good. Yeah. What was your paper with BCS 70?
We were looking at the educational gradient in obesity. We were looking at how people who are more highly educated are less likely to be obese.
Yeah.
And the main finding was that although there are many causal effects, being educated to university level, even after taking into account the other obvious possible causations, that people who are educated to university level are less likely to be obese.
Mm-hmm.
And if I stand, you'll see the proof. There you go.
If I stood, you'd see the, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to stand because you might see the counter, the outliers from that. Yes, and some of that was shown in the chart that I showed with the BMI across generations. I guess you could locate the 1970 cohort and the difference between their social class, but you can draw them by education as well, and see quite a similar pattern.
So thank you.
So, well, you're welcome. And I guess one of the amazing features about these studies, compared to lots of others, they're not just in the sort of pocket of the people who create them. So researchers under sort of suitably governance undertakings around confidentiality and so on. And the studies are fully sort of, the personal details of the people taking part are completely removed anyway. But researchers around the world use these. Many, many thousands of researchers around the world are using them. It's not just us.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there another, Janet? Yes, Janet, please go on.
Actually, because I'm also an economist, and I did a lot of
I am too, by the way. I'm an economist.
teaching about inequality and various issues around that. And so I guess what fascinates me about what you've just shown is the extent to which those are proxies for other things that are going on. So when you're looking at educational achievement for children of families who are on the lower economic level, I guess what I think about is, okay, what does that tell us about perhaps the time that the parents have to spend with their children? Because although there may be two parents, they're both working minimum wage jobs, they're having to pick up extra work, so they don't have the time to interact with the children. That if they're living in rental accommodation, that can be quite, that can be temporary. They can have to move a lot, which means they're moving schools, which means they're moving away from their support system, maybe family support system, and their friends, and all of that, how that all adds up. So I guess it's just, to me, it's always interesting what lies behind the base statistics and what you can think about that you can cull from that. And I guess just, thinking of all those different things, it's not just enough to say, well, they came from poorer families, but it's like, what does that mean for child development, and how can society kind of help to overcome that by putting in things like the Sure Start program, which was to take children and make sure that they had more time, that people were reading to them, or that they were playing with toys, and that and with other children, to develop conversational skills and all of those things.
So absolutely, and one of the reasons why our studies are used a lot compared to, say, administrative data on educational inequalities is because we tend to capture quite good measures of various of the things that we talked about around the home learning environment and parenting styles, and different kind of aspects of the material resources and the time spent by parents. So one of the nice things we had in our COVID survey was a sort of time use, a brief sort of time use instrument, and we could see, for example, how much time women were putting into the homeschooling of their children, and at the same time they were much more likely to have given up work and the furlough. But then looking at the different kind of activities with children, if you took a kind of child-centric view on that, rather, so we looked at it through the prism of gender inequality for that particular thing, but we but also look at, children from different backgrounds and how much time spent on what types of activities, which is an important dimension to all of this, as you've said.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alissa, for being with us tonight. It was a great talk, and as Caroline said on Facebook, it's fascinating how little we sometimes know about our members from KLS. So I think it was tonight a good occasion for us to get to know you better.
Thank you. Yeah.
And my last thought about what you said, it's what I found it really interesting. It's about facts. It's not about ideology. It's not about we should do that. It's about this is the reality. So in a way, people who have the power to make change, to implement change, they should look into the kind of works you're doing in order to implement proper policies that will really change something, and not having this kind of fantasy, if we throw away all the refugees, the country will be better. It's not that. It's about, going into facts. So thank you very much, Alissa. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you with us tonight. So now, friends, it's time to conclude our service with a Kaddish. So if you have names you would like to name tonight, please put it on either on the chat section of Zoom or on the comment section of Facebook. And on this Shabbat, in the newsletter, we have Alan Ray, the father of Paul Ray and grandfather of Ben and Natasha. And I saw that Paul was with us tonight. So Paul, I wish you and your family a long life. Harry Goldie, the father of Doreen Keane, Marjorie Simons, the mother of Jill Hyman, and I think Jill is also with us tonight. Jack Lyons, the father of Philip Lyons, Zichronam Livracha, may their memory be a blessing. And we say together the Kaddish on page 524. 524. No, yes. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבר ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו, לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תוש בחטא ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל בני אדם ואמרו אמן. A few announcements for us as a community. So tomorrow we have the bat mitzvah of Firuze Oizirek Bear. Her sister had a bat mitzvah last week, so tomorrow it's Firuze's moment. There is on Sunday Midsummer Film Crushes in the garden. So I don't know if you can use the garden. It's quite rainy at the moment, but if it's not in the garden, I'm sure you'll find a way. There's also an event organized by Liberal Judaism about dignity in dying, with Rabbi Daniel Rich and Baroness Molly Meacher, who will be in conversation, focusing on the topic of assisted dying, the new religious alliance that I mentioned, I think a couple of Shabbats ago, that Liberal Judaism has joined. We have our usual Hebrew classes, and I know that Dominique is here with us tonight, so I wanted to thank you, Dominique, for the free, oh gosh, you have 3 groups now in Hebrews for beginners. That's really amazing, and I can tell you that they love it. They all tell me how great you are as a teacher, so thank you for doing that. Next Shabbat, 7:30, choral Erev Shabbat with Rebecca Weden and myself. And we have a family service next Shabbat in the morning. So there's a lot of news in the newsletter. So I don't know if you've seen it. The garden team has come up. So I think I don't want to miss any name, but I think it was Vince. You can correct me. So there was you, Brian, and Linda, and who else?
Mark Wolf.
And Seymour.
And Jenny Wolf as well.
And Jenny Wolf, yeah, okay. So they put up a nice sign, which you will see tomorrow. I don't know if you can see from my screen. It's in the newsletter. So that's a new careless sign in the garden. It's really nice and well done. I saw it this morning when I went to KLS. It's really nice. So well done and thank you for doing that. And remember, for those of you who are new members, just a reminder that on Saturday, the 24th of July, we have a new member Shabbat, and it's not limited to new members, of course. It's anyone who wants to join. So welcome back to you all. We will probably use the garden still because it's still a bit tricky. Vince, yes.
Yes, I know that people do not always have time to read all of what goes into our news bulletin. So I'd like to mention that in the next edition or the current edition, I'm not sure, we're asking members to nominate charities that they think are deserving of our support. So please take a look at the bulletin to see how you might go ahead with that.
Thank you. So that's the High Holidays appeal, huh?
It's continuing the use of the monies collected at the last High Holy Days.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so that's in the bulletin. I can see that. Yeah, so please go back to Vince about that. Right, and other news in the newsletter. So let's do a final song together. And if you want to mute yourself, please do it. It's going to be a bit cacophonic, but it doesn't matter. What matters to hear all your voices. And it's good to be together on Zoom and soon to be together in the sanctuary. Adon Olam, page 524. Adon Olam asher malach b'terem kol yitznicha be'et sokol azay melech shemonicha ve'acharei kichlot hakol levado im lo nora ve'u haya ve'u oved ve'u yeh v'tifara ve'u echad ve'en sheni le'amshil lo le'achmira ve'li reshit ve'li tachlit ve'lo ha'oz ve'hamizcha ve'u eli v'chai go'ali ve'tzur li be'et tzara ve'u nisi u'manos li menat kosi beyom ekha beyado afkid ruchi be'et tishan ve'ayira ve'im ruchi geviyati Adonai li ve'lo yicha. Nora, sorry, I just saw that you also wanted to remember your uncle for the Kaddish. Beyado afkid ruchi be'et tishan ve'ayira ve'im ruchi geviyati Adonai li ve'lo ira. Into your hand I place my soul, asleep awake for you are near. And with my soul, my body too, you are my God. I shall not fear. Shabbat Shalom. So let's do the Kiddush together.
Shabbat Shalom.
So, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Oh, hello.
Shalom.
Yeah. So Alissa, it's very much a cat's community. So when we heard the kitten, it's really, hello, how are you? So Kiddush on page 5.
Hi, Ziggy.
René, just to say, about cat community, we're not so sure.
Yeah, there's also dogs, absolutely. Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank
It's
you.
a pets
Hi,
community.
Natalia.
No, you're right. You're right. You have to fight for it. You're right.
Exactly.
You're right.
Thank you, René.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh gosh, it's getting bigger. Huh? Wow.
It's
I
very
remember last
big.
time I saw it. It's a she, if I remember. Huh?
No, it's a he.
It's a he. Yes, getting bigger. Huh?
Yeah.
Gosh. Wow. So yeah, we do love our pets at KLS. Let's put it this way. Right. Okay. Page 564. And as usual, I don't have my challah tonight, so I will ask you to show your chalot and to say the blessing over. Can see Natalia is always.
Mine is overbaked and it's from last week, but it counts.
It's okay. Yeah. It doesn't. There's no date of. Yeah, a cracker is good as well.
It's ginger flavored.
It's okay. It's okay. יום השישי, ויחולו השמיים וארץ וכל צבאם, ויחל אלוהים ביום השביעי מלאכתו אשר עשה, וישבות ביום השביעי מכל מלאכתו אשר עשה, ויברך אלוהים את יום השביעי ויקדש אותו, כי בו שבת מכל מלאכתו אשר ברא אלוהים לעשות. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן, אמן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו ורצה בנו, ושבת קודשו באהבה וברצון הנחילנו, זיכרון למעשה בראשית, כי הוא ים תחילה למקרא קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים, כי בנו בחרת ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים, ושבת קודשך באהבה וברצון הנחלתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת, אמן. לחיים.
L'chaim, you know that, Margaret?
So, who wants to do the motzi? Okay, let's do it together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, המוציא לחם מן הארץ. Amen. B'te'avon. So thank you for those who joined us on Twitter, Zoom, and Facebook. And Shabbat Shalom